On February 26, 2022, just 2 days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a momentous decision was made by the United States and the European Union, a move destined to fundamentally reshape the global financial landscape. They declared that Russia would be severed from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, universally known as SWIFT. This indispensable messaging network links 11,000 financial institutions across 200 nations, facilitating the daily transfer of a staggering $5 trillion. The exclusion of Russia from SWIFT meant that their banks were effectively barred from engaging in international payment transactions, halting trade finance and cross-border exchanges, thus imposing severe economic isolation. The Western nations hailed this as the ultimate financial sanction, envisioning Russia's economy in ruins, its currency collapsing, and its leader, Vladimir Putin, compelled to withdraw from Ukraine or face internal upheaval. However, 2.5 years have since elapsed, and an unexpected reality has emerged. Russia has not crumbled, its currency has stabilized, and its trade has persisted, albeit through alternative channels outside of SWIFT. Furthermore, this event served as a stark warning to numerous other countries, prompting them to develop their own financial infrastructures, realizing that if the United States could arbitrarily exclude a nation from the global financial system for geopolitical motivations, it could do so to any country. This instance is not unprecedented. The weaponization of financial infrastructure by a dominant power has occurred 4 times in the past 110 years, each following a predictable pattern. The dominant power wields control over the financial system to penalize adversaries. The targeted entities seek and establish alternative mechanisms. Neutral nations diversify their positions, and consequently, the efficacy of the original weapon diminishes. The dominant power, in its pursuit of ultimate leverage, inadvertently erodes the very foundation of its own supremacy. Let us examine these 4 historical precedents, illustrating a recurring 5-stage pattern that is currently unfolding with SWIFT and the dollar, positioning China as a significant beneficiary and suggesting a timeline where the dollar's status as the primary reserve currency could face obsolescence within approximately 20 years. This time frame draws parallels to the British pound's decline from its reserve currency status, which occurred 30 years after Britain weaponized finance in 1914. As the United States deployed the SWIFT weapon in 2022, the clock is ticking, and this transition is likely to be expedited due to the pre-existence of alternative systems and the accelerating pace of technological advancement. Before delving into the ramifications of the SWIFT weapon's counterproductive outcome, it is imperative to understand SWIFT's operational nature and its significance. SWIFT itself is not a bank. It neither holds nor transfers funds. Its core function is as a secure messaging platform. When a bank in New York intends to transmit $1 million to a bank in Tokyo, SWIFT facilitates the secure exchange of messages between them, conveying instructions such as authorizing the transfer. The actual movement of funds occurs through correspondent banking relationships, with SWIFT serving as the vital communication conduit that enables these transactions. Established in 1973 by 239 banks across 15 countries, SWIFT replaced the earlier, less efficient, and less secure interbank telecommunications system. By standardizing messaging, implementing robust security protocols, and ensuring the speed and reliability of cross-border transactions, SWIFT revolutionized international payments. By 1977, SWIFT was handling 10 million messages annually, a figure that surged to over 11 billion in 2024, averaging approximately 45 million messages per day. SWIFT evolved into the central nervous system of global finance. Its potency stems from its Belgian domicile, a stance of technical neutrality, yet its governing board is predominantly comprised of American and European banking representatives. Furthermore, the United States possesses considerable legal leverage due to the fact that the majority of international financial transactions are settled in U.S. dollars through correspondent banks in New York. This arrangement empowers the U.S. to exert pressure on SWIFT, potentially leading to the exclusion of specific countries or financial institutions. Exclusion from SWIFT renders international trade exceedingly difficult, effectively isolating a nation economically. The United States has previously employed this financial leverage. In 2012, the U.S. exerted pressure on SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks, a measure that proved devastating for Iran, causing a collapse in oil exports as buyers struggled with payment mechanisms. This resulted in a contraction of Iran's economy by 9% and an inflation rate of 45%. The sanctions ultimately compelled Iran to engage in negotiations, culminating in the 1944 nuclear accord. While seemingly effective, the swift weapons application against Iran spurred the nation to develop alternative payment channels, including barter systems, cryptocurrency adoption, and non-dollar trade agreements with countries like China and Russia. Consequently, when sanctions were reimposed in 2018, Iran demonstrated greater resilience due to its reduced reliance on SWIFT. However, the disconnection of Russia from SWIFT in 2022 represented a significantly different scale of action. This involved not a smaller nation, but the world's 11th largest economy, a major energy supplier, a nuclear power, and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. The exclusion of Russia from SWIFT transcended mere economic warfare. It served as a definitive declaration that the U.S.-controlled financial system possessed the power to ostracize any entity on political grounds. Every nation observing this event grasped the implicit message. Defiance of the United States carried the risk of losing access to the global financial system, the potential freezing of national reserves, the isolation of banks, and the strangulation of economies. This presented a critical existential dilemma for all non-Western nations. Either accept perpetual vulnerability to American financial dominance or actively cultivate alternative systems. The prevailing choice was to pursue the latter, marking the point at which the SWIFT weapon began to backfire. Now, let us examine the 4 historical precedents, which consistently demonstrate that financial weaponization ultimately proves counterproductive. This pattern has repeated 4 times over the past century, with each instance finding the dominant power believing it wielded absolute control, only to accelerate its own decline. The first instance occurred during World War I, from 1914 to 1918. When the British pound held the status of the world's reserve currency, and London was the epicenter of global finance, controlling approximately 65% of international reserves. Upon the outbreak of war in August 1914, Britain enacted the Trading with the Enemy Act, empowering the seizure of assets belonging to German nationals and entities. British possessions throughout the empire were commandeered, including German-owned businesses, bank accounts, vessels, and property. This action broke a long-standing convention in international finance, which had historically remained separate from warfare, with belligerent nations honoring financial contracts even amidst conflict. The immediate consequences for Germany were severe, with its companies losing assets globally and its banks denied access to London markets, leading to a collapse in German trade. Britain perceived this as a decisive strategic advantage. However, neutral nations observed and internalized a critical lesson. If Britain could confiscate German assets, it could seize the assets of any nation during a conflict it deemed significant. Funds held in London were no longer secure unless approved by the British government. Following World War I, neutral countries began diversifying their reserves away from London, increasing their gold holdings and establishing accounts in financial centers such as New York and Paris. The United States reaped substantial benefits from this shift, with New York banks acquiring business previously directed to London. By 1920, the U.S. held greater gold reserves than Britain, and by 1925, New York rivaled London as a financial hub. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 formally ratified the dollar's ascendancy over the pound as the global reserve currency, signifying the end of Britain's 30-year period of financial dominance. The pattern here is clear. Britain controlled the system, weaponized it, leading to diversification by targeted and neutral nations, and ultimately a loss of control for Britain. The second instance involved the United States and Iran in 1979. In November of that year, following the seizure of American hostages by Iranian revolutionaries, President Carter ordered the freezing of all Iranian assets held in U.S. banks, amounting to approximately $12 billion, comprising $8 billion in bank deposits and $4 billion in other assets. This represented the largest asset freeze in history at that time, justified by Iran's violation of international law. While intended to pressure Iran for the hostages' release, the freeze had unforeseen consequences. Nations worldwide, particularly those in the Middle East and OPEC, became acutely aware that dollar reserves held in U.S. banks could be unilaterally seized, not through military conquest or default, but by executive order. A president could freeze assets with a simple phone call, rendering sovereign wealth held in dollars in New York effectively non-sovereign. Throughout the 1980s, OPEC nations began to diversify their reserves, reducing their dollar holdings from approximately 85% in 1977 to around 71% by 1991. They increased their holdings of Deutsche Marks, Japanese yen, and gold, and established accounts in London, Zurich, and Singapore to mitigate concentration risk in New York. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates reduced their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. This marked the beginning of a gradual decline in the dollar's share of global reserves, a trend that continues to this day. While the Iranian freeze achieved its tactical objective, with hostages released in January 1981, partly due to economic pressure, its strategic impact was profound. It demonstrated to the world that dollar reserves could be weaponized, prompting a global imperative to diversify. The U.S. gained leverage over Iran, but lost the trust of many other nations. The third instance, involving the United States and Russia in 2014, saw targeted sanctions imposed after Russia's annexation of Crimea. Russian officials faced bans from the U.S. financial system, and Russian banks encountered restrictions. Crucially, Russia was not severed from SWIFT. These sanctions were calibrated to signal disapproval without forcing Russia into a complete adoption of alternative systems. This proved to be a strategic misstep by the U.S., granting Russia 8 years to prepare. From 2014 to 2022, Russia systematically reduced its dependence on the dollar. U.S. Treasury holdings by Russia decreased from $130 billion in 2013 to just $2 billion by 2020. Russian gold reserves surged from 1,000 tons in 2014 to 2,300 tons by 2022. Russia also developed its own domestic system for financial message transfers, known as SPFS, a direct analog to SWIFT. Furthermore, Russia engaged in trade agreements with China, India, and other nations that allowed for payments in rubles, yuan, or rupees, circumventing the dollar. President Putin publicly declared from 2014 to 2022 Russia's intention to reduce dollar exposure due to the perceived insecurity of dollar reserves, explicitly stating the U.S. used the dollar as a weapon and that Russia required independence. Western analysts largely dismiss these statements as rhetoric, arguing that Russia was too integrated into the global economy to decouple. However, Russia was resolute in its strategy. Consequently, when the sanctions were implemented in 2022, Russia was prepared. The 2014 sanctions had a partial effect, slowing Russian economic growth and deterring investment, but they also provided Russia with the time and motivation to build alternatives. Had the U.S. either refrained from action or implemented a full SWIFT cutoff in 2014, the outcome would have been different. Instead, the U.S. opted for a middle ground, signaling its intent while allowing Russia to prepare, a strategy that proved to be the most detrimental. The fourth and most significant instance occurred in 2022, again involving the United States and Russia. On February 26, 2022, the U.S. and the EU announced the exclusion of major Russian banks from SWIFT, alongside the freezing of approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. This was widely regarded as the ultimate financial sanction, aimed at isolating Russia financially on an unprecedented scale. The immediate impact was dramatic. The ruble plummeted 30% within 2 days. The Russian stock market was temporarily shuttered to prevent a complete collapse, and ATMs experienced cash shortages amidst public panic. Western media prematurely declared economic victory, forecasting Russia's collapse within months. However, an unforeseen development transpired. Russia demonstrated remarkable stabilization. The Russian central bank enacted a 20% interest rate hike, effectively halting the ruble's decline. Russia then mandated that European nations pay for gas in rubles, artificially bolstering demand for the currency. The ruble recouped all its losses within 3 months. Russian trade continued through non-Western channels, with oil exports redirected to China, India, and the Middle East, settled in yuan, rupees, and rubles. By late 2022, the Russian economy had stabilized, and by 2023, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6%, surpassing the economic performance of Germany and the United Kingdom. However, the most profound repercussions were not felt by Russia, but by the dollar and SWIFT. Every nation observed the event and understood that the U.S. possessed the power to freeze reserves and sever access to SWIFT for political motivations. For countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, the implication was clear. While not currently in conflict with the U.S., any future dispute, whether over Taiwan, Kashmir, trade policy, or any other issue, could lead to the freezing of their trillions in reserves and exclusion from SWIFT. The precedent was irrevocably set. Consequently, these nations embarked on a path of diversification, mirroring the actions of Britain's adversaries in 1914 and Iran's allies in 1979. They began building alternatives, thus initiating the five-stage pattern of financial weaponization, backfiring. Let us now delineate this five-stage framework, illustrating how financial weapons inevitably backfire, a phenomenon that has occurred 4 times and is presently unfolding. Stage 1, the dominant power controls the payment system. From 1973 to 2022, the United States effectively held sway over SWIFT. While SWIFT is headquartered in Belgium, the U.S. exerted influence primarily through the settlement of most SWIFT transactions in dollars via New York correspondent banks. The U.S. Treasury Department could sanction banks, and the Federal Reserve could deny access to dollar clearing, rendering SWIFT inoperable without U.S. cooperation. This control over SWIFT was intrinsically linked to the U.S.'s dominance of the dollar, which in turn was underpinned by its economic and military strength, forming the bedrock of its financial supremacy. Stage 2, weaponization for foreign policy objectives. From 2001 to 2022, the United States increasingly utilized financial sanctions. Following the September 11th attacks, the U.S. targeted terrorist financing, subsequently expanding these measures to encompass rogue states such as Iran and North Korea, and later Russia in 2014. Each escalation normalized the concept of financial warfare. By 2022, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the deployment of the SWIFT weapon appeared almost inevitable, as the necessary infrastructure, presidential authority, and political will were all in place. Thus, the U.S. proceeded to cut Russia off and freeze $300 billion in reserves. Stage 3. Targeted entities seek alternatives. Unable to utilize SWIFT, Russia turned to alternative systems. SPFS, Russia's domestic network, experienced expansion. CIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, emerged as a primary conduit for Russia's trade. For certain transactions, cryptocurrency was employed, while barter arrangements served others. By 2024, 40% of Russia's trade was conducted in non-dollar currencies. Bilateral trade between Russia and China reached $240 billion in 2023, conducted almost entirely in yuan and rubles. Trade with India was largely settled in rupees, and trade with the UAE occurred in dirhams. Russia's experience demonstrated that economic survival was possible even when excluded from the dollar SWIFT system. Stage 4. Neutral countries hedge their positions. This is a pivotal stage. It extends beyond Russia's development of alternatives to encompass dozens of nations not currently under sanctions, but apprehensive of future repercussions. China, observing the events, accelerated its de-dollarization efforts, reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $775 billion by 2024. China significantly increased its gold reserves, officially reported at 2,264 tons, but unofficially estimated to exceed 4,000 tons. China also expanded CIPS, processing over $500 billion in payments by 2024, a substantial increase from $300 billion in 2021. Saudi Arabia, a U.S. ally for 80 years, reevaluated its stance following the freezing of reserves. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia announced its acceptance of yuan for oil sales to China, effectively breaking the 50-year petrodollar monopoly. In December 2024, Saudi Arabia joined BRICS, signaling a departure from exclusive alignment with the U.S. The UAE, another key Gulf ally, began settling trade with India in rupees and dirhams, bypassing the dollar. Brazil and Argentina are negotiating a common currency for bilateral trade. The BRICS nations, now expanded to 9 members, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, are actively developing a shared payment system and discussing a gold and commodity-backed common currency. Even U.S. allies are diversifying. The EU developed Target 2, an alternative payment mechanism initially for trade with Iran, with potential for broader application. Japan and South Korea are increasing their holdings of yuan and reserves. Over 50 central banks are currently exploring or implementing alternatives to dollar and SWIFT dependency. This strategic shift is not driven by anti-American sentiment, but by the realization that $300 billion could be frozen by executive order, rendering national reserves inherently insecure. Stage 5. The original weapon loses its power. This is the current phase. While SWIFT retains its dominance, its influence is waning. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024, a reduction of 13 percentage points, representing trillions of dollars in diversification. More critically, the dollar's share in international trade settlement has fallen from approximately 73% in 2022 to roughly 58% by 2024, a 15 percentage point drop in just 2 years, marking the fastest de-dollarization in history. SWIFT message volume continues to grow in absolute terms, but its proportion of international messages is diminishing. CIPS processed 136 million messages in 2023, up from 91 million in 2022, reflecting 50% growth in a single year. SPFS handles approximately 2 million messages daily within Russia. India's Unified Payments Interface processed 12 billion transactions in 2024, including a growing volume of cross-border activity. Alternative systems are rapidly scaling. The crucial insight is that while the SWIFT weapon achieved tactical success in the short term, causing economic shock to Russia, it ultimately failed strategically. Russia survived, and the SWIFT weapon can no longer be wielded with the same effectiveness because potential targets now anticipate and prepare for such actions, and neutral countries have established alternatives, rendering them less vulnerable. This is the established pattern. Stage 1, control of the system. Stage 2, weaponization. Stage 3, targets finding alternatives. Stage 4, neutral countries hedging. Stage 5, the weapon losing its power. Britain experienced this cycle from 1914 to 1944. The United States is currently undergoing a similar transition, projected from 2022 to 2042. Now, let us examine the specific data providing irrefutable evidence that this pattern is unfolding in real time. These are not predictions. They are established facts. Russian trade data reveals a significant shift. In 2021, prior to sanctions, 87% of Russian trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2024, this figure has fallen to 60%, meaning 40% of trade is now conducted in yuan, rubles, rupees, dirhams, and other currencies. Bilateral trade between Russia and China has reached $240 billion, with the vast majority settled in yuan and rubles. Similarly, Russia-India bilateral trade amounts to $65 billion, largely paid in rupees. Russia serves as a critical test case, demonstrating the feasibility of operating outside the dollar SWIFT paradigm. China's CIPS system has experienced remarkable growth, processing approximately $27 trillion in payments in 2023, more than doubling its volume from 2020 in just 3 years. CIPS now connects over 1,400 financial institutions in 110 countries and settles transactions in yuan, presenting a direct and rapidly expanding alternative to dollar SWIFT. Central bank gold purchases have surged, with 1,136 tons bought in 2022, 1,037 tons in 2023, and over 1,000 tons in 2024. This marks 3 consecutive years of purchases exceeding 1,000 tons, the highest sustained level since the 1970s, immediately preceding the collapse of Bretton Woods. The primary buyers include China, Russia, Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore, and the Czech Republic, all converting dollar reserves into gold, an asset that cannot be frozen or sanctioned. Bilateral currency swap agreements are also proliferating. China has swap agreements with over 40 countries, totaling approximately $500 billion, facilitating trade settlement in local currencies without the need for dollars. Russia has swap agreements with China, India, and Iran. India has similar arrangements with the UAE and Japan, among others. Brazil and Argentina are in discussions regarding a common currency. ASEAN nations are exploring local currency settlement for intra-regional trade. All these initiatives bypass the dollar and the petrodollar system. For 50 years, oil pricing and sales were exclusively conducted in dollars, creating a consistent demand for the currency. However, in 2023 and 2024, this monopoly ended. Saudi Arabia now accepts yuan for oil sales to China, Russia sells oil to India in rupees, the UAE accepts dirhams in yuan, and Iran sells to China in yuan. Iraq is also in negotiations to accept yuan. While the petrodollar is not defunct, its monopolistic status has been broken, and the advantages derived from such a monopoly rapidly diminish once it is challenged. The expansion of BRICS and the development of alternative currencies are also significant. BRICS expanded from 5 to 9 member nations in 2028. These 9 countries collectively represent 45% of the global population, 36% of global GDP, and 42% of global oil production. During the 2023 BRICS gathering in Johannesburg, member nations revealed plans for a unified currency, backed by a diverse collection of resources such as precious metals, energy, and essential minerals. While this initiative is not yet operational, the underlying message is unmistakable. BRICS is actively constructing an alternative to the existing dollar-centric financial order. The evidence is compelling, demonstrating that the diminishing role of the dollar, or de-dollarization, is not a future concern, but a present and accelerating reality. Each month witnesses a reduction in the dollar's proportion of global reserves, while the volume of transactions through the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, expands quarterly. Furthermore, an increasing volume of international trade is being conducted using local currencies annually. The utilization of SWIFT as a financial weapon has effectively shattered the dollar's former supremacy. To illustrate this shift, let us examine the historical trajectory. How much time remains before the United States experiences a loss of the dollar's reserve currency status? We can infer this by observing the historical decline of Britain's global standing. In 1914, Britain leveraged its financial power by confiscating German assets. By 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the dollar formally supplanted the pound as the world's primary reserve currency. This transition took approximately 30 years from the initial financial maneuver to the complete transfer of status. However, it is crucial to note that Britain also endured 2 devastating world wars, which significantly weakened its economy. The imposition of financial sanctions alone did not lead to the pound's demise. It was a confluence of factors including economic warfare, global conflicts, and subsequent economic mismanagement. The United States is not currently engaged in widespread global conflicts, and its economy remains the largest worldwide, suggesting that its decline might be a more gradual process. Nevertheless, the accelerating pace of modern technology plays a significant role. In 1914, the development of alternative payment infrastructures required decades. By 2024, CIPS experienced exponential growth, increasing from 12 trillion to 27 trillion units in a mere 3 years. Digital payment systems possess the capacity for exponential expansion, potentially hastening this decline. Based on historical patterns and the current pace of acceleration, my projection estimates a timeframe of 15 to 25 years from 2022 for a significant shift in the dollar's reserve status. This places the potential collapse of its dominant reserve position somewhere between 2037 and 2047. While the dollar may not be entirely eliminated, it will likely cease to be the preeminent global currency. We can anticipate the dollar's share of reserves declining from its current 58% to approximately 35 to 40% by 2040. This would represent a substantial decrease, yet still a significant portion. The euro might capture around 25%, the yen 20%, and gold and other assets 15 to 20%, ushering in an era of the multipolar currency influence. The direction of this change is already established. The dollar's share of global reserves has diminished by 13 percentage points between 1999 and 2024, a period of 25 years. If this trend continues at the same rate, another 13 percentage point drop would reduce its share to 45% by 2049. However, the rate of decline is accelerating. The past 2 years alone have seen a 4 percentage point decrease. If this accelerated pace persists, we could reach the 45% mark by 2035. The projected timeline, therefore, spans 10 to 25 years, not centuries or generations, but rather 1 or 2 decades. Let us now consider the practical implications of this shift. Presently, the United States can sustain virtually unlimited budget deficits because the global economy requires dollars for trade and reserves. Foreign nations acquire U.S. Treasury securities to obtain dollars, enabling the U.S. to borrow approximately $2 trillion annually at low interest rates. The U.S. effectively exports inflation through its dollar dominance. However, when the dollar's share of global reserves falls below 40%, this considerable advantage will evaporate. Foreign demand for U.S. Treasuries will plummet, leading to a sharp increase in American interest rates. Budget deficits will become unsustainable, compelling the U.S. to balance its budget or face severe inflation. The American standard of living, which relies on importing more than exporting and financing the difference through dollar issuance, will become unviable. This marks the end of an era of perpetual financial ease. Now, let us examine who stands to gain and who will face losses in this evolving landscape. China emerges as a significant beneficiary. It is poised to inherit the mantle of global financial leadership from the United States. China possesses the world's second-largest economy, its most extensive manufacturing base, the highest trade volume, and an increasingly influential reserve currency. CIPL serves as China's equivalent to SWIFT, and the yuan is steadily gaining traction as a reserve currency. Furthermore, China holds substantial gold reserves. Its technology giants, such as Alibaba and Tencent, are providing payment infrastructure that rivals established Western systems. As the dollar's influence wanes, the yuan's prominence will rise. China does not need to militarily confront the United States. It simply needs to allow the dollar to unravel under the weight of its own inherent contradictions, exacerbated by American financial policies. Russia secures a strategic advantage. While its economy is smaller than China's, Russia has demonstrated its resilience in the face of swift exclusion. This precedent is invaluable, as it assures every nation apprehensive of U.S. financial power that viable alternatives exist. Russia's survival has debunked the myth of U.S. financial invincibility. Moreover, Russia has fortified its relationships with China, India, Iran, and other nations, effectively positioning itself at the nexus of an alternative economic bloc. The BRICS nations, including Brazil, India, and South Africa, along with new members such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all stand to benefit from a multipolar currency system. These nations will gain increased leverage, allowing them to strategically play major economic powers like the US, China, and the EU against each other, thereby escaping the confines of dollar dependency. India serves as a prime example of this newfound autonomy. It has maintained its diplomatic and economic ties with Russia, even amidst US pressure, by purchasing discounted Russian oil and settling transactions in rupees, facing no significant repercussions. This model represents the future for middle-tier global powers, offering greater independence and diminishing U.S. dominance. Gold, as a traditional safe haven asset, will also benefit. As nations lose faith in fiat currencies, they turn to gold. Central bank purchases of gold are currently at a 50-year high. Alternative payment systems will flourish. Networks such as CIPS, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, SPFS, in Russia, India's Unified Payments Interface, UPI, Brazil's PIX, and various cryptocurrency exchanges will all see increased adoption. Any system facilitating non-dollar, non-SWIFT transactions will gain market share. Financial technology companies in China, India, Russia, and other regions will profit from the diversification away from Western-dominated financial frameworks. Now, who will suffer losses? The United States will experience a decline in its global hegemony. This decline will not be immediate or catastrophic, but rather a gradual and irreversible process. The dollar's reserve currency status forms the bedrock of American power, enabling extensive deficit spending, the efficacy of sanctions, and the ability for the U.S. to live beyond its financial means. As dollar dominance erodes, these advantages will inevitably diminish. The U.S. will be compelled to balance its budget, and its military expenditures may become unsustainable without continuous borrowing. The American standard of living will likely decrease in relative terms compared to the rest of the world. This does not imply that America will become impoverished, but rather that it will transition to a status of a large, affluent nation rather than a singular hyperpower. Europe, like the United States, will also face repercussions. European nations have closely aligned themselves with the U.S. dollar system and have participated in U.S.-led sanctions against Russia, including the freezing of Russian assets and the exclusion of Russian banks from SWIFT. While this has aligned Europe with U.S. foreign policy, it has also tied its economic fate to the dollar's decline. The euro could have emerged as a viable alternative to the dollar, but Europe has not pursued this strategy with sufficient vigor. Instead, Europe has largely followed U.S. leadership. Consequently, as the dollar weakens, the euro may not automatically rise to fill the void. The yuan is more likely to do so. Europe risks becoming economically subordinate to both the U.S. and China. SWIFT itself will experience a loss of relevance. Although a Belgian company, SWIFT is widely perceived as a Western financial instrument. As countries diversify away from Western financial systems, their reliance on SWIFT will decrease. While SWIFT will not disappear entirely, it will likely become one of several prominent payment messaging systems, rather than the singular dominant one. SWIFT's revenue is generated through transaction fees. As transaction volumes shift towards CIPS, SPFS, and other emerging systems, SWIFT's business model will weaken. Holders of dollars will see a depreciation of their wealth. Individuals and entities possessing dollar-denominated assets, such as treasury bonds and dollar bank accounts, face a decline in purchasing power. This is not anticipated to be hyperinflation or an overnight collapse, but rather a persistent erosion of value, potentially 5 to 10% annually as the dollar loses its relative strength against other currencies and gold. An investment in treasury bonds yielding 4% interest, while simultaneously experiencing a 7% loss due to inflation and currency devaluation, represents a negative real return. This scenario will likely prompt investors to seek alternative assets, further accelerating the dollar's decline. American consumers will also experience a reduction in purchasing power. The United States consistently imports more goods than it exports, resulting in an annual trade deficit of approximately $800 billion. This imbalance is currently sustainable because foreign entities accept dollars as payment. When this acceptance diminishes, the U.S. will be forced to either increase its exports or reduce its imports, leading to fewer available goods, higher prices, and a lower standard of living. The typical American household, accustomed to the affordability of Chinese goods, inexpensive foreign oil, and a wide array of imported products, could face price increases of 20 to 30% over the next decade as the dollar loses its reserve currency status. The timeline for these shifts is already established. The utilization of SWIFT as a financial weapon in 2022 initiated a predictable 5-stage pattern of backfire. We are currently in the 4th stage, characterized by neutral countries hedging their positions. The 5th stage, where the weapon loses its efficacy, is now commencing. By 2030, the dollar's share of global reserves is projected to fall to 50%. By 2040, it could be around 40%. While the U.S. may still possess the largest single currency share, its dominance will be lost. This heralds the arrival of a multipolar currency world, and the U.S. will inevitably be diminished by this transition. Allow me to conclude with this observation. The SWIFT weapon appeared formidable. In February 2022, Russia faced frozen asset reserves and maximal pressure. However, financial weapons, much like nuclear ones, can typically be deployed only once. Their initial use prompts the development of countermeasures. Russia initiated the creation of alternatives. China accelerated the expansion of CIPS. BRICS initiatives grew. The petrodollar system has been undermined. Consequently, the SWIFT weapon has become largely ineffective, as any nation the U.S. might consider targeting has already developed or is in the process of developing alternative financial mechanisms. The United States could have maintained a dollar dominance through economic strength, fair trade practices, and adherence to established global systems. Instead, it opted for financial weaponization, including asset freezes, SWIFT exclusions, and the use of the dollar as a coercive instrument. While this approach proved tactically effective against smaller nations like Iran, it backfired significantly when applied to Russia. This backfire is systemic, extending beyond Russia to encompass a substantial portion of the global community actively disengaging from the dollar-based system. Britain weaponized its finance in 1914 and lost its reserve currency status by 1944. The U.S. weaponized SWIFT in 2022. Historical patterns suggest that the U.S. could lose dollar dominance by 2042, possibly sooner due to the accelerating influence of technology. This is not merely a prediction, but an observation of recurring patterns. Financial weaponry invariably leads to unintended consequences. The dominant power, convinced of its ultimate leverage, inadvertently educates the world on the necessity of building independent alternatives. Once these alternatives are established, the power of the original system inevitably wanes. The SWIFT weapon effectively destroyed SWIFT's monopoly, and the dollar's weaponization has undermined dollar hegemony. The primary beneficiary of this self-inflicted wound is China, the patient rival that has witnessed America dismantle its own sources of strength. China did not achieve this through military might. Rather, America's own actions led to its decline. The five-stage pattern is now complete. The U.S. exerted control over SWIFT and the dollar, wielding them against Russia. Russia responded by seeking and developing alternatives. With over 50 nations now hedging their positions, the effectiveness of these financial weapons is diminishing. This marks the conclusion of dollar hegemony, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a gradual erosion of influence. It is a consequence not of military defeat, but of financial self-sabotage. The SWIFT weapon served its purpose only once. Its future utility is negated because the world has learned a crucial lesson. Build alternative systems, reduce reliance on the dollar, and ensure immunity from U.S. Financial coercion. If this analysis has illuminated a previously unseen pattern, if you grasp the concept of financial weapons backfiring, and if you recognize that the SWIFT cutoff was the catalyst for the dollar's decline, not the zenith of its power, then you understand the geopolitical landscape of the next 2 decades. The dollar will recede, the UN will ascend, the world will embrace multipolarity, and the U.S. will be weakened, not due to aggression from China, but as a direct result of American policy decisions. The United States possessed a golden goose, and through its policies of sanctions and coercion, it has effectively strangled it. Welcome to the post-dollar era. While it has not fully arrived, its emergence is imminent. The timeline is set, the pattern is evident, and the SWIFT weapon served as the definitive trigger. In 20 years, historians will look back at February 2022 and identify it as the precise moment American financial dominance ended, a fact that may not have been fully comprehended at the time.